Chapter 9 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Agnes Howard's Secret. After Mrs. Luckett had taken her departure, Warburton retired to his study, and his sister proceeded to wash the tea dishes with the help of her little maid. Emily Warburton worshipped lovely things, and it was a pleasure to her to use the old Worcester cups and saucers, and keep burnished the old Georgian and Queen Anne plate. She put to daily use all the few beautiful articles the house contained, and she took care of them personally. There were never any domestic troubles at the vicarage, because the two maids were well aware of the big share their mistress took in the household work. Miss Warburton's life was in many respects a narrow and restricted one, but she was a very happy woman, despite the fact that her heart was buried in the grave of her dead lover. She had never sighed after any other man, resigning herself to her memories and the duties of her daily life in her brother's parish. She adored Ambrose, and insensibly since her loss her love for him had become more maternal than sisterly. His welfare was the first consideration of her earthly life, and she would willingly have relinquished her position as mistress of the vicarage had she seen any symptoms of a desire on his part to marry. She had detected none. Attractive young women of her own class seemed non-existent in the neighbourhood, and it had never occurred to her that his fancy might fall upon some rosy-cheeked farmer's daughter. The Warburtons had blue blood in their veins, and the consciousness of this doubtless worked as a barrier to mésalliance, though there was no sign of pride of birth to be detected in either brother or sister. Emily had no conception of that which Ambrose hid so skilfully from her, his putting aside of all thought of marriage on her account. Now, as he sat in his study alone, he took himself severely to task for the small admissions he had made to Mrs. Davenant. He was pondering over the conversation that had passed between them as they strolled across the fields, and he remembered with sudden shock that he had spoken of something which hitherto he had kept secret in his own breast. He had told her that after his mother's death Emily had become his special charge, and that death had also robbed her of her lover. Mrs. Davenant had replied, "I think you've been sacrificed to your family. Supposing this should reach the ears of Emily, what would she think of him?" It was unlikely that Mrs. Davenant would betray his rash confidences, yet on the other hand she might do so. He did not place much reliance upon her discretion. He felt he hardly knew her, she was so elusive. There was nothing simple in her confidences to him. Always he was conscious of big reservations. A wave of colour, due to pure annoyance with self, flooded his cheeks. He rose and began to move restlessly about the shadowy old room. He could not understand himself, or how he had ever been led to make such dangerous admissions. Never even to so dear and old a friend as Mrs. Carleton had he confessed as much, and Mrs. Davenant had parted from him in the belief that he had been sacrificed to his family. That was not true, and he hated untruth. He knew that if he had ever really loved a woman well enough to ask her to marry him, he would have permitted nothing to stand in his way. It was true that he had thrust aside all thoughts of marriage because of his sister, but he had never really been tempted to act otherwise. Life in that respect had been made very easy for him. He rarely left home, and here he had met no woman whom he would have cared to install in the vicarage as wife. Suddenly he pulled himself up sharply, and stood still in the middle of the room, staring into vacancy. Was it literally true that he had seen no woman whom he could remotely conceive of as a desirable wife? A curious self-revelation was welling up within him. It seemed to arise from unplumbed enormous depths, to be the insistent revelation of another and deeper self-clamouring to be heard, and slowly it took mental shape in the form of a woman. Agnes Howard. Let the counsel of thine own heart stand, for there is no man more faithful unto thee than it. The words from the Apocrypha floated through his brain as he stood there staring through the open window to where a thrush was joyously bathing in a stone basin on the lawn. The beauty of the physical world struck potently upon these new revelations, bringing with them a wild gambler's zest in the appreciation of their fleeting tendencies. Agnes Howard! Yes, he had liked her from the first, and he had seen a good deal of her from time to time since her arrival in their midst. She had contracted quite a warm friendship with Emily. The two women hit it off, as he expressed to himself their apparent sentiments. He had seen much more of Miss Howard than of Mrs. Davenant. They were of totally different natures. There was a lightness and frivolity about the latter that was lacking in her companion. Agnes Howard suggested greater self-reliance and steadiness, and she had shown to him that she possessed a deep fund of sympathy and considerable worldly knowledge. Yes, he had been greatly attracted towards her from the first, and now he knew that this attraction was developing into something infinitely warmer. Subconsciously he had been aware of this. Now the knowledge had crept over the threshold and arrested the startled attention of his ordinary waking consciousness. For a moment or two he abandoned himself to its sweetness, telling himself, what matter, she was unattainable, and besides, had he not decided never to marry? Surely he might give rein to his imagination for a few moments. Surely he might dream of what such a love would mean in his grey life. Then a little serpent of fear crawled about his heart. His grey life? Supposing this new feeling grew into unmanageable dimensions, supposing a love developed in him which was stronger than his self-control, what then? His grey life! Did he really think thus of his pleasant, leisurely existence? Was a man's life necessarily grey if bereft of the love of woman? The answer flashed back instantly, unhesitatingly, yes. It was true. Grey was the soft, sober colour of peace, of the dove's wing. A lovely, meditative tone, really the absence of colour, but it was half mourning. Life, to be full and perfect, must be tinged with rose. He could think of married lives that had begun in clouds of rose, and now had faded into old rose. An exquisite colour, reminiscent of bygone loves and joys, of loves sobered by age and life's realities, but still rose. Faded tints of love's young dream, which he had never known. The old saw recurred to him. It's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. He took up his pipe, filled and lighted it mechanically, and sat down in an armchair by the empty grate. Then he fell to wondering about Agnes Howard's life. Why had she never married? Had she loved and lost? A woman so obviously desirable must have had many lovers. She was still very handsome. Once she must have been beautiful. Some very strong reason must have held her single. What was the mystery lying at the heart of those two lives dwelling within the old dower house? Some mystery he was sure did exist, though he had never dreamed of probing it, and discouraged the belief in others of its existence. He had become very sensitive of late to all idle gossip relating to the two ladies. Now he knew why, and he shrank back from the knowledge as a new-born discovery with which he dreaded to deal. He stared about the shadowy panelled room, and the twilight silence of it struck him suddenly as a rousing sensation, more trying to his nervous organisation than any jangling would have been at the moment. For the first time in his life, the lack of marital relations smote his brain with a strong sense of personal loss. Man was not made to live alone. The words surged through him as if clamouring to imprint their true meaning, which even yet he hardly realised. He had lived a placid and ascetic life, thoroughly healthy and free from morbid longings, the life of an unthinking animal, afar from temptation. Suddenly he seemed to feel the need of a soul's companionship. A crowd of confused sensations assailed him. Doubt, happiness, misery, wrangling together discordantly. His soul, aspiring always towards spirituality, was protesting against the material instincts of the body. From out the peaceful, unthinking past had sprung up a new set of impressions, electrical, and to him terrifying in their persistency. His nervous system was unhinged. Something foreign had entered in and was making itself strongly felt. A new side of his nature had slidden uppermost, which the religious temper of his life had bidden him suppress. Human nature, deeming it a crime that violence should be done to its strict fidelity, was insidiously pointing out hazardous and pernicious courses. In his scrupulous idealism he had always looked upon himself as a part of a great faith, which had grown through and through his life, as the roots of a tree bind themselves round some finite structure. Suddenly his foundations were shaken from under him, and a vision almost beatific of new possibilities of life opened out before the rent secrecies of his soul. It seemed to him that he had paid too high a price for the life of celibacy he had lived. He had sacrificed a myriad sympathies and hypothetical joys. "At last I know what it would mean to live," he whispered below his breath. Only the pregnant silence answered him, and as its voiceless echoes eddied round the room, the dark curtain fell again. Life was grey. A pause. Voices were drifting in to him from the garden. He stiffened, listening intently. Then he leapt to his feet, and taking his hat he passed through the back of the house into the village. Meanwhile Emily Warburton had strolled out amongst her flowers, and began gathering a nosegay of everything sweet she could find. She was a noted gardener, and the work of her hands and the joy of her heart was one of those things visitors in the neighbourhood were always taken to see in the time of the roses. To-night she was intent upon a little service of love she constantly offered up, and with her scissors she carefully cut off 2 white moss roses and added them to her bunch. "May I join you for a few moments?" Emily glanced up and met the smiling eyes of Miss Howard fixed upon her from the far side of the sweet-briar hedge. "Why, of course, do come in. Have you had tea?" Agnes replied that she had, and was out for a stroll in the cool of the evening. "I've been getting rid of a headache all day, and Hilda was tired. She's been off on one of her long tramps, so I sallied forth alone," she said, passing through the little wicket and joining Emily on the wide turf walk. She threw up her head and smiled appreciatively. "How heavenly! All the scents blended together make one absolutely perfect perfume, which I suppose can never be bottled. Are you making a bouquet for someone?" "Yes, I'm making a bouquet for someone to whom I always give my best. I'm going to take it to him in a moment. Will you come? It isn't far." "I'd love to come," Miss Howard answered, as she moved about amongst the flowers, bending over the tall lilies, then over the roses, and drinking in their fragrance. Agnes Howard was looking very well in a perfectly cut holland coat and skirt. In the creamy laces at her breast she had fastened a bunch of crimson roses. On her dark hair was set a wide-brimmed leghorn hat, trimmed with a simple black velvet band. Emily noted the supreme elegance of her companion's attire, but with no touch of envy. She was quite aware that her simple cotton frocks were of rustic cut and make, but that never disturbed her. She was always exquisitely neat, but she had no natural love of fine clothes for herself, though she immensely admired those worn by other people. "I'm ready now," she called softly to the idly strolling figure at a little distance. The old grey vicarage stood on rising ground which looked across a softly undulating valley. The great Glentworth woods sheltered it behind from the northern blasts. The southern frontage looked out over a wide expanse of copse, pasture land, and winding river. Closely adjoining the house was the little Norman church, with its low arched roof, its quaint carvings, its solid square tower, its round-headed leaded windows. The two women took a short cut by a path leading to the churchyard, dark with the shadows of venerable yews, yet singularly peaceful in the golden glory of the autumn evening, and as they walked up the narrow path between many an unnamed grass-grown grave, Emily paused and bent her head. For 10 years she had never failed to pause there in passing. When first she had bent her head before the white cross, her hair had been glossy, black as the raven's wing. Now it was banded with white as the marble upon which was inscribed, "To the undying memory of Clifton Carew, Major, 18th Hussars. There is no death, what seems so is transition. This life of mortal breath is but a suburb of the life Elysian, whose portal we call death." Both women stood in silence looking down on the grave, Agnes Howard reading the inscription for the first time. "Did you know him?" she asked gently. Emily had stooped to pick up a bunch of fading flowers that lay on the green mound. She laid her fresh nosegay in its place and straightened herself. "Yes, I knew him well, and loved him dearly. We were to have been married, but he died a fortnight before our wedding day." She was smiling, and her voice was just the same, calm and composed. But for a few seconds Agnes Howard gazed at her in absolute confusion. Then she felt herself in the throes of a great emotion. When she came to search for words, she could find none that were consecutive. The reality of the tragedy overwhelmed speech. "I had not heard. I had no idea that such a sorrow had fallen upon your life," she stammered. Emily was speaking again in her quiet, unemotional way. "He was the only man I have ever cared for. He caught a chill after saving 2 children who had fallen through the ice at the edge of the river. It was a very hard winter that year, and though he changed into dry clothes almost at once, pneumonia set in and nothing could be done. I sat by him in the vicarage and saw him die. That's my life story, a very simple and common one, but for me, well, it meant just this. All the heart I possessed was in his keeping. It is his still, and will be his, I believe, throughout eternity. So many women live happily on with their dead hopes and faded memories. Mary of old time must have been one of those. I have always felt how deeply she loved our Lord. She gave all she had, her sacrificial love, in a flask of fragrant ointment, poured out at the feet of her beloved, who died a few hours after for the sins of the world." Agnes Howard's eyes were clouded by unshed tears, not those of sorrow, but born of the sharp vibrations running through her of another memory, of her own. There fell a silence between them, and then Emily spoke again. "Don't look so sad. I don't know why I brought you here, or why I told you this. I acted on a sudden impulse, born of some innate sympathy I find in you. It always seems so strange to me that such fidelity to love as I own for my lover, and he owns for me, should be counted as morbid sentimentality rather than a virtue. Alas, the world is still a very long way from grasping the full meaning of immortality. It is as if the so-called dead have, since the world began, beaten fruitlessly against the iron walls of the human breast, their entreaties falling on deaf ears, their memories hidden away under the weight of costly stone and marble in the cemeteries of the world. How cruel it seems to let the beloved souls go out into the unknown, mourned by futile tears which dry so soon and are so soon forgotten. Have you ever thought, Agnes, how sadly the departed must mourn over the broken bridge deliberately severed by those remaining on earth?" "I can understand such thoughts coming to you," replied Miss Howard earnestly. "They are thoughts coming to many more now, since the war desolated so many homes," went on Emily. "It was whilst I stood by this open grave on a clear winter morning, whilst I looked down into the tomb where they had lowered the coffin, that something bade my thoughts look up, and my heart gave a sudden throb of joy. I had looked on death, and death had looked back and smiled on me from a land full of life and vigour, love and sunshine, and I realised that life and death are one. I knew I had not left my beloved lying there cold and alone, and I no longer felt the same towards a freshly made grave. Never again did I call death by the name it was known by on our earth, for it no longer symbolized to me tombs and corpses. It was given to me to know that death is not death to the dying, but only to the blind ones left behind." They stood silent and very still a moment or two amid the singing of the birds. A lark had carried its music out of sight high up against a grey cloud, as larks so often do before gathering and departing, and as they listened to the exquisite rain of song, Emily spoke again very softly. "Yes, I am faithful and ready when God wills." Had her words found their home? It seemed to Agnes Howard that she could not doubt. She smiled suddenly, her eyes filled with a glad acquiescence. Then she threw out her hands in one of her sudden graceful gestures. "Oh, how good it is to know you, to know how faithful a woman's heart can be, and how happy that faithfulness can make its possessor. Ours is really the sympathy of a common sorrow, which in our different ways we have outlived. I suffered a similar loss, though it did not come about in a similar manner." Emily bent her head in comprehension, and slipped her arm into her companion's. "Let us stroll quietly on for a little. It's so good to have someone to confide in. I've never really had anyone before. I try never to talk on sad subjects to Ambrose. So you lost your lover also, Agnes?" "Yes, he left me for another woman whom he ultimately married. That marriage only endured a year. I was then living with my brother in Washington, and I continued to live on with him till he also died. Since then Mrs. Davenant and I have been inseparable companions." "You never thought of marrying anyone else?" asked Emily. Miss Howard shook her head. "Never. This man treated me shamefully, yet at first I cared so much for him that I promised to be his wife. He killed all love out of me, and for years after I despised and disliked all men. I've got over that now. I'm alone in the world, my parents and brother are dead. I don't expect ever to see America again." "But you're not American?" "No, we are British born, but my brother became an American citizen. I adored him, and looked after him as you look after your brother. He died unmarried, and why is his secret, not mine." "Oh, but you are happy now, are you not?" asked Emily rather anxiously. "I am quite happy and cheerful, mothering Ambrose." Miss Howard laughed rather mirthlessly. "Oh, yes, quite happy, even though I've got no Ambrose to mother. I wonder he's never married. I suppose you make him so comfortable he doesn't feel the need of a wife." "He's never seen a woman he cared to marry," declared Emily with conviction. "I would not have stood in his way if he ever had. I don't suppose he'll ever marry now, bless him." They had reached the gates of Little Glentworth, and she paused and held out her hand. "We are agreed that our conversation shall be regarded as absolutely private?" she asked. "Oh, yes," answered Miss Howard. "I would not have spoken as I have if I hadn't felt you were to be trusted. Good night, Emily." "Good night, Agnes." Miss Warburton had walked on but a very few steps when she heard her name called softly, and turning round she perceived Agnes Howard running back to her. "Emily," she whispered rather breathlessly, "I feel there is one person whom I should like to share my confidence with you. I know he is so entirely trustworthy." "My brother!" Emily knew instantly to whom Agnes referred. It seemed to her a very natural feeling. Everyone told their secrets to Ambrose. "It shall be as you wish, dear. He is absolutely trustworthy," she answered. With a smile and a wave of her hand, Miss Howard walked quickly away. End of Chapter 9.